Palm Sunday. It commemorates the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem riding on a donkey on the eve of Passover along with all the other pilgrims. And it fulfills a prophecy from Zechariah. Behold, O Israel, your king comes to you humbly riding on a donkey. Well, you could say that the gospel writers clearly made up this event. They wanted to show Jesus as a king. They found a prophecy in Zechariah, so they said Jesus had gone into Jerusalem on a donkey, and it didn't really happen. But there is an alternative that does seem more likely to me, which is that Jesus himself was reenacting this prophecy. He did deliberately do something to make a point or a series of points to call forth echoes from the prophecy of Zechariah. And there is precedent for Jesus himself and other holy figures doing this in ancient Israel. Well, what are these messages and what sort of impression was Jesus trying to give? Well, it seems to me the messages were extremely mixed. On the one hand, he was coming very humbly on a donkey. Zechariah mentions the humility of the king. But on the other hand, it must have been an extraordinarily striking event. When you consider that all the other pilgrims would have been entering Jerusalem on foot, singing psalms, then you have Jesus riding on a beast, surrounded by his followers. It must have appeared to be making an extremely obvious royal impression. And it's not surprising that the crowds proclaimed him as a king in the manner of David, the son of David, and shouted, "God save us," and Hosanna, and waved branches and threw down their clothes on the road for his donkey to walk on. And why were they doing this? What aspirations did they have? Well, Passover was a festival of national liberation. It was, in that sense, the most important festival at the time for the Jewish people. And it was a particularly poignant festival when it was celebrated in the years when Israel was under Roman occupation, because here was a foreign power indifferent to the customs of the people, full of misunderstandings of their faith, and having certainly no interest in their national aspirations. Far from it. The Romans obviously wanted to keep the Jews as subservient, as obedient to Roman rule. It didn't want them proclaiming a king of Israel. And so we can understand why people would have been yearning for some sort of national liberator. And when Jesus came into Jerusalem on a donkey, it's not surprising that they proclaimed him in this way. There would have been people among them also who would have been living at a subsistence level, and possibly they were just hoping for a square meal, because one of the prophecies often made of the Messiah is that he would organise a great banquet where everybody would be fed forevermore. And anyone who has experienced extreme hunger will understand the lure of this sort of prophecy, whereas most of us who have not experienced extreme hunger will possibly find it harder to sympathise, harder to understand. And so this very mixed message was being delivered. And it was a message which would lead inevitably to the frustration of most people's hopes, because it was the humble side of what Jesus was doing, the serving side, that won out, because this was going to be a very different kind of king from the king that people were expecting. His followers were largely unarmed, no revolt was organised. If we have a rather charming picture of these crowds waving their palm branches, let's not forget that at the back of their minds would have been the desire that very shortly they would have been putting down their palm branches, drawing swords and starting to kill Romans on a large scale as part of their national liberation. It was this sort of expectation, it was this sort of hope that the people were having. And they're much criticised by Christians today and over the centuries for their fickleness, because it was these very same crowds who, when it turned out that Jesus was not going to be a great leader, was not going to be a great king leading them to freedom, it was these same crowds that called for his crucifixion. And they didn't understand that the only kind of kingship that Jesus was going to offer them was the kingship of the crown of thorns. The only throne from which he was going to reign would be the throne of the cross, experiencing utter humiliation and the death at the hands of his tormentors. And it seems to me too easy for us to dismiss the crowds, to say that we as Christians know better. We can understand what Jesus was really about. We can understand that he was going to be a very different kind of king. Because one of the things that I think is very helpful and instructive to do when we read any of the Passion stories through Holy Week, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and so on, is rather than saying we're on the side of Jesus, putting ourselves as the followers of Jesus, followers who really understood what Jesus was all about, as none of his real followers actually did. Instead, we should realise that these stories are teaching us something. We should put ourselves not in the role of an idealised follower of Jesus, but actually of the real followers of Jesus as the people who were proclaiming him. We should furthermore put ourselves in the place of the chief priests, of Judas Iscariot, of Peter, of the crowds who called for Jesus' crucifixion, of Pontius Pilate himself who gave the judgment. Because there are ways in which we actually do, as Christians, behave like those crowds. We have the same sorts of aspirations in our own lives. If as Christians we follow Jesus because we think somehow it's going to smooth out all our difficult relationships, bring us prosperity, bring us happy lives, bring us good fortune, then we are just like those crowds, hoping for something that Jesus was never going to promise and was never going to bring. Because the way for all Christians to follow, if they follow Jesus, is the way of the cross. And this is something that we need to remind ourselves of, especially in Holy Week. We don't become Christians, we don't follow Jesus because we think our lives are going to be made easier. It is a perilous temptation that is seen among Christians over the years and in all sorts of different ways today. A perilous temptation to think that being a Christian will bring you obvious signs and wonders in your life, obvious healings and cures, obvious prosperity, obvious wholesomeness in all your dealings and relationships with other people. And when we find that life in fact goes on being difficult, goes on being tough, we may believe that God has abandoned us, that Jesus has not kept his promises, when the healings and the cures do not come, when the relationships remain difficult, or we remain poor and in financially difficult circumstances. What the story of Holy Week teaches us, what the story of what Jesus was about, what Jesus was doing, is something really very difficult, really very challenging indeed. Yes, there is Easter. Yes, there is the hope of resurrection. But there is no resurrection without prior crucifixion. There is no Easter without Good Friday. And unless we are prepared to follow Jesus through all the events of Holy Week, the abandonment, the loss, the death, unless we are prepared to follow him that far, we are not really appreciating or understanding what Jesus is about. And if this seems to be a very pessimistic and gloomy message, turn it round, turn it the other way round. Just as there is no resurrection without crucifixion, there is no crucifixion, there is no death, there is no blighting of all our hopes, the abandonment of all that we hold dear, without the hope of the resurrection that is promised to us. And that resurrection is a great hope indeed, and it is on that which we must place our faith as Christians, on that and nothing else, not the temporary hopes, the temporary aspirations, the material goods for which the people at the time of Jesus, and all people ever since, on which they have set their hopes. All these must be lost, all these must go, all these must ultimately be crucified. But when that has happened, the hope of the resurrection is a glorious one indeed.